game-changing discussions on the big ideas that shape our thinking. This is One-to-One.
So what does it take to hold the line when the world is at its most vulnerable? Where does leadership find clarity when every decision carries consequences for millions? My guest today has lived those questions at the front lines of public health leadership across 3 continents. Dr. Chikwe Ihekweazu is Executive Director of the World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Programme, former founding head of the Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence Hub in Berlin, and the first Director General of Nigeria's Center for Disease Control. Chikwe Ihekweazu, welcome to One-to-One.
Great to be on your show, Tokes.
Thank you for joining us.
Quite a journey.
Yes, quite. I'd rather thought that we might have to go all the way to Geneva or maybe even Berlin to fetch you. But here we are in Lagos, Nigeria. So let's dive straight in. Chikwe, you are Executive Director, World Health Organization Health Emergencies Programme. You're leading the WHO's global preparedness and response to health emergencies across the organization's 3 levels, HQ, regions, and country offices. Previously, you were Assistant Director General and founding head of the WHO's Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence Hub in Berlin. Sounds a bit like code breaking. Blechny comes to mind.
Well, yeah, the term is used in different ways.
Absolutely. You've been very intricately associated with epidemic intelligence for much of your career. And of course, we'll come back to that later on. You've served as Assistant Regional Director for Africa, and you were in that role between February and June last year, following an unexpected vacancy that occurred after the passing of Dr. Faustin Ndugulele of Tanzania. He died in 2024, didn't he? Did you know him personally?
I knew personally a fair bit, and it was a tragic loss of a dear colleague who had actually won an election to lead WHO in the region. But it was an absolute privilege to sit in that role for a few months.
Absolutely. You're an infectious disease epidemiologist by training, and you're widely recognized as a systems builder, someone who has strengthened public health institutions, outbreak readiness, and epidemic intelligence capacity, first nationally, of course, here in Nigeria, and then globally through your various appointments at the World Health Organization. Perhaps best known for scaling and professionalizing the Nigeria Center for Disease Control during a period of repeated outbreaks, so we say, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. You were the NCDC's first Director General. You were appointed to lead the agency in 2016. But it's fair to say that you already led responses to outbreaks of Lassa fever, meningitis, yellow fever. So you're not by any means a one-trick pony. Quite famously, of course, COVID-19. And so, Chikwe, I've left anything out. Here's my question at this point. Who is Chikwe Ihekweazu? Just in case.
So thanks for that. To be honest, you've articulated a fairly sometimes dramatic career in public health. But the truth is, I never started my career thinking I'd even be in public health. So I think like many of us, I trained to be a physician. I look forward to actually being a surgeon. And that was the career path I'd chosen. But a few set of circumstances took me into public health, and I found this incredibly fulfilling career where there are no right or wrong answers to big complex problems. There are different approaches to solve it, and I just love the complexity and the challenge of this space, and have chosen that. So in a way, professionally, I've drifted from a very beginning, an exciting career in clinical medicine in Nigeria in tough circumstances in the Southeast. Did my house job in Aba, did my youth service in the police college here in Ikeja, and ultimately veered into public health, and I found my calling in it.
Of course. And we shall, of course, explore that drift as you say. So let's talk a bit about your work. So at the WHO, leadership isn't just about Geneva, is it? It's about aligning headquarters, regions, country offices under pressure, immense pressure, quite a lot of the time. You led across all three. So let's go back and begin at the moment where it all became quite real for you. Okay? You stepped into the NCDC for the first time as Director General in 2016. What was the most uncomfortable truth you discovered about Nigeria's epidemic preparedness at that point?
Well, folks, I still remember that week because it was so vivid in my consciousness, Of course, first it was getting the appointment and the excitement it generated. You have to remember this period was, the early months of the Buhari era and the hope and anticipation that came with it that finally Nigeria was turning the corner and we had a leader that we all thought will take us to this promised land. And, I was part of that. And when I was appointed, our generation, all the friends we knew, I had no opportunity to even reflect on the opportunity because, the congratulatory messages were intense. Everyone transferred their hopes for the country to my shoulder, and I got to this place, in Abuja. I walked around our offices and we had 70 staff only, including drivers, security, everyone, total of 78. I asked questions, I looked around the offices. It was depressing in terms of just what I found, and there were a few bright lights there, but they had no mission, no vision, no understanding of their roles. I would try and drive conversation and drive questions, and so it was very depressing, to be honest. But at the same time, I had worked one way or the other. This was my 20th year in public health, and all those 20 years had been working in national public health agencies in Germany, the UK, and then in South Africa. So I kind of knew what needed to be done. So I think after a week, I went back to Vivian, my dear wife, and, we talked about this, and we said, listen, we're here. We will make it work. And the journey started. So, we started building. And sometimes it's easier to build from a low base, because you do see results. And we did see the results. And then the results became self-fulfilling after a few months. But it was a very tough beginning. And I don't think NCDC was unique. The public sector institutions, I wouldn't be surprised if you walk into many of them today and you get the same feeling.
Of course. And of course, we'll dip a bit more into that in the course of this conversation. So, Chikwe, take me back a little, just before the NCDC and before the crisis, even. You trained and you worked in some of the world's strongest public health systems. You worked in the UK's Health Protection Agency. You worked with the Robert Koch Institute in Germany, as well as the South African National Institute for Communicable Diseases. Three very different, profoundly different public health cultures. What did those early years teach you about how societies really respond to and manage outbreaks?
Yeah. So thanks. It was really a privilege. To be honest, when I left Nigeria in the late 90s, early 2000s, I didn't know about the existence of national public health agencies because we didn't have any in Nigeria, and this was the early years of the HIV pandemic. And I was privileged to come back to Nigeria doing my master's and spent 3 months in the Ministry of Health in the HIV program at the time, NASCAP. And so I kind of had a good understanding how public health was run under a ministerial setup in Nigeria. And then my career took me to the Robert Koch Institute, then the Health Protection Agency, then the South African National Institute for Communicable Diseases. And I saw that the expertise that you needed to prevent, prepare, and respond to health emergencies cannot be delivered through a bureaucracy of a ministry. That you really required an expert and a parastater to do that. I mean, a good equivalent is in the financial sector. You have a central bank and you have a Ministry of Finance. They're related, but they're different. The expertise to manage the economy is in the central bank. The policy-making framework is in the Ministry of Health. The same in defense. You have a Ministry of Defense and you have an army. The army does the doing, the ministry does the policy. But in our context, we didn't have that separation. Everything was in the ministry. And so the biggest lesson I learned from that is you need the expertise to understand infectious diseases and health threats, to prepare for them, to prevent them, to understand what it takes to respond to them in a specialist agency. And that's ultimately what we evolved to in Nigeria at NCDC. But it was through that experience at the Robert Koch Institute from a very junior role, but at the beginning of the first SARS outbreak, so I had a frontline seat to the response, working in the UK's Health Protection Agency at all levels. So at the local level, where it was individual cases of TB or measles, to the national level, and ultimately in South Africa, which had a big HIV and TB epidemic. And so through those various opportunities in my career, really prepared me for the challenges that came later on. But, it was just an interesting opportunity. And I must say, none of this was through any strategic career planning. Many times I was at the right place at the right time and took the opportunities that came my way whenever they just.
So what do those experiences tell you then about how these different cultures respond to crises, to epidemics?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest lesson is the work we do is almost like an insurance policy. Insurance is something no one wants to pay for, but it's a necessary expense because you want to sleep at night, knowing that if anything happens to your property or your lives or whatever it is, that there's a way to respond to that emergency, right? So the work we do in public health, you're never going to bring a president to cut the tape that you prevented an outbreak that never happened. So there's very little political capital to be gained out of it. But advanced societies have understood that they still have to invest in these things that protect people. And so the big lesson there is, yes, you can do the fancy infrastructure projects that bring you whatever capital you're seeking, but you also have to invest in these quiet institutions that enable you to sleep at night. And we're one of those from the aspect of health security, the threats to our health security. And I think it's still one of the biggest societal threats that we face every day.
Of course. So let's talk a bit about the Berlin hub, that intelligence pillar that sits within the broader emergencies architecture, the WHO. Before you, of course, this hub for pandemic and epidemic intelligence did not really exist. Is it right to say that you founded the hub? Is that right?
WHO founded it, and I think all the credit has to go to our DG, Dr. Tedros, who really conceptualized this during the pandemic when he recognized that there was a gap in terms of our collective ability to collect, analyze, and use data for decision-making with the rapidity it requires, and set this up, and then invited me to come and lead it and drive it forward.
Yeah, and of course, we're talking here about intelligence as opposed to surveillance, actually, which we'll come to later on. So you were, assuming, recruited specifically to build this from scratch in the pandemic preparedness push that followed COVID-19. So you led really the conceptual framing of epidemic intelligence, didn't you? And things like the decision where to locate it. Why Berlin to begin with?
Well, I think firstly the decision was made before I came, but I think the rationale for the decision was firstly we had an incredibly progressive leader in the Chancellor for Germany at the time, Frau Merkel, who really supported WHO and supported the creation of the hub and its location in Berlin. But there was also such an amalgamation of opportunity. You know, Berlin had created this incredible ecosystem in tech, in innovation, in the digital space that provided us a lot of the individuals to recruit from. There were other institutions in Berlin, the Robert Koch Institute itself, the Charité Hospital, one of the biggest hospitals in Germany, that enabled us have a partnership in Berlin. It was close enough to Geneva to be away from the mothership, but close enough to still assess the opportunities of that the headquarters could provide a hub. So there are a series of factors that enabled Berlin to be such a great location for the hub. And, you know, I think it's proven its worth. It's incredibly successful part of WHO at the moment, driving, pushing innovation, pushing how we use data to make decisions, supporting many countries to build their own capacity. So, you know, there were many post-pandemic initiatives all around the world. You know, in the energy we all derived out of the response. Unfortunately, many of them did not survive because of various factors. But the hub is one of those institutions that has proven its worth, has grown in importance, and continues to serve the world out of Berlin.
So you were instrumental to the instigation of one that did survive.
Well, proud of it, yeah.
What was that experience of building like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, our staff number 001 in Berlin. And, you know, it's incredibly fulfilling when you build from zero. You know, we started with a team that had joined us from Geneva to start the groundwork. And then we started recruiting. We had to not only build internally, but we also had to communicate to the world why it was important to build that institution, what relevance it would be. The question they asked, why was it in Berlin? You had to raise resources for the institution. So there are all aspects of it, not just technical. It's also validating your existence and continuing to grow despite the decline in the pandemic. So, you know, it was a really fulfilling experience. I'm really happy and proud that today we have 100 staff of about 100. About half of that are WHO staff, half are partners from around the world that come to Berlin. We have a fellowship program. We have staff coming in and out of Berlin from many countries around the world for 3 to 6 months. And they all leave there inspired to go back to their countries and keep building. And this space, you know, the space between public health, data science, tech, digital is an incredibly progressing area of work. Because we have left the kind of traditional enclave of our profession to open up a little bit to others. And through that influence, those intersections, is where magic is happening. And that's, I think, where provides us an opportunity that with now the introduction of artificial intelligence, really provides us the nucleus of the protection that the world needs into the future.
Of course. So we've talked quite a lot about the space, epidemic intelligence, your work in the WHO, but of course, what has been present throughout all of this, even though we haven't spoken specifically about it, is how you as an individual have interacted professionally, emotionally, and otherwise with all of this. So we'll start to drill down a bit more into that now, shall we? So, Chikwe, I'd like to know, to begin with, at what point did it become clear to you that this work in epidemic control wasn't just about technical expertise, but it's fundamentally a governance challenge?
So I would say my first profound insight was in the year 2000. I attended the first international conference on AIDS that happened on the continent. It happened in Durban. it was the first time I had a paper accepted in a conference. It was just a poster, so it wasn't anything significant. But I was in Durban, right? And, I finished my medical training in 95, 96, house jobs, youth service in the late 90s. And, Tokes, you remember, because I think you also had a very similar career path. I saw patients, I remember patients until today that literally passed away in my hands because they had HIV. And there was nothing we could do as doctors. We had no treatment, we had no tools to manage this disease that was increasing in prevalence. And at that conference, it was clear that treatment was increasingly available in the West, right? Only that it costs $10,000 per patient per year to enable them access. And the continent, with 90% of the cases in the world, had no access to treatment. And that was where it became clear to me that this wasn't a scientific problem because science had provided a treatment. It wasn't skills because we had doctors. I was a doctor. It was that we hadn't organized ourselves in a way globally to enable these treatments to become available to those that needed it the most. So it was there that I recognized that there was a problem in the world. I might not be able to solve it, but I wanted to contribute. And that's where public health and everything that comes with it comes in. How do we drive the policy changes, the changes in governance that can enable life-saving interventions become accessible? I couldn't do that facing a patient in front of me. I could only do that by engaging in that governance. So I think that was a profound moment. And that was where, up to then, I still wasn't sure. I had started public health, but I kind of always thought I'd go back to clinical medicine because ultimately that's what we're trained to do. But it was at that moment that I knew that we had to engage in this problem in a different way. And I wanted to contribute to the solutions that we had to find in a governance level.
Yeah. Profound. That was your epiphany and really interesting. So I'd like, therefore, to come back again to the NCDC. Yeah. You arrived, and I make a lot of your arrival each time I lead up to these questions, don't I? You arrived to lead an institution, an organization that was young, fragile, largely untested. What weaknesses did you find were hardest to change? Not because they were scientific, but we've just been talking a lot about other matters, but because they were essentially political.
So let me answer this question in two ways. Firstly, the biggest challenge I found with the 70 people I found at NCDC is that many of them did not believe in themselves. They did not think that they had what it took to do the work that was required of them, and that it was okay to just stay under the radar, keep your heads down, get whatever small salary we could get, and just, manage, So there wasn't any internal motivation to deliver on any mandates, right? That was one. Secondly, there wasn't any expectation from the people that put you there to deliver on anything. When I came, no one told me, listen, this is your vision. This is our vision as a government for NCDC. These are your expectations. These are what you should deliver. So you are left to your own capacities, your own ambitions, for better or for worse. So it was up to me in that case, but it would be up to any leader in a parastate or in most places in Nigeria. You make a decision when you're appointed. There's very little expectation of our leadership, at least from my experience, on what to do. So I had to, and we all have to, both set those expectations for the people you lead, but also derive the expectations from the people that are appointed.
Did you struggle with that?
I struggled with it. I deeply struggled with it, because, what were you there for? So But we got round to it, and we set on a plan. I literally activated every network I had prior to coming in NCDC to come and help me fulfill its mission. Every colleague I had that worked in the previous places I worked for, that worked for WHO, that worked for the international, I called them up. I said, how can you help? I got, there's an institution called the Tony Blair Institute. I happen to know a few people there. I called them, listen, I know you do organizational transformation. Can you come and help me? They gave me 2 consultants to come and work with me pro bono for 6 months. They sat with me. They developed the first strategic plan for NCDC. We launched it. I brought all the team together. We convinced the federal government to allow us to recruit a few more people. The first set of 100 recruits, mostly young people. And so we, and then I have lots of, I came in, the leader of NCDC was, prior to me, was sending emails with Yahoo email addresses. I said, I will not send my first formal email with Gmail or Yahoo, that we will send this up. I found a few young people, I literally twisted their arms. We set up an email. It sounds rudimentary, but it still happens today. Many government officials today, as we speak, still send the Gmail address.
Absolutely.
Ministers still send the Gmail addresses. So the first website that we set up was set up within a month of starting at NCDC. That is the same website up today at NCDC. So there are many things that if you don't believe you can do it and you've had no exposure of where it works, you don't know what you don't know. So you can't create what you never know, what you've never known. So I was lucky to come into an institution similar to those that I'd worked in, and there wasn't too much motivation or staff or resources, but we pushed and created something that, I know we'll get to the pandemic, but just to say that today, retrospectively, you could think that we spent 3 years preparing for a pandemic. But of course, we didn't know a pandemic was coming. We spent 3 years building an institution that I think Nigerians deserve. And, I shudder every day, I think, if the COVID-19 pandemic had started 3 years earlier, what could we have done as a country? I still get goosebumps thinking about, July 2016 when I arrived. If that pandemic had started in January 2017, not January 2020, what could we have done? And so those 3 years that we spent building that institution, building a public sector institution that was ready to serve and stand up and not embarrass our country, was the work we did quietly in the 3 years before people began to hear about NCDC in January 2020.
Incredible insight, and you're absolutely right. And you're beginning to use this as a window into the state of our public institutions, and of course we'll get there as well. But I'd like to learn from you at this point. What was it you learned about attempting to or reforming a system that seemed configured almost by design, bureaucratically, culturally, politically, to resist change?
So, Tokwe, I'm not even sure the word is to resist. It's almost like we're designed to fail.
I'm trying to avoid it.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
we have got to put this. Correct. I'm privileged now to have done this for 5 years. So, we all talk about how we wish Nigeria to work, and sometimes it doesn't, right? But having been there for 5 years, I think I have the legitimacy to speak about it, right? Let me just give an example that anyone leading a parastatal will recognize. The smallest part of your budget is your recurrent expenditure limits. Most parastatals struggle with that. But, every parastatal has to buy petrol, buy diesel, pay for electricity, pay for band A like we do, all these expenses. Where if you're not resourced to do that, you have other lines of expenditure in your capital budget. You have to then use resources from your capital expenditure to pay for your recurrent expenses. Once you do that, you have broken the rules of government. They come after you, and the rest follows, right? So if we don't start thinking, how do we actually be honest with ourselves in terms of what does a parastatal require to run? What do you need to pay your staff? What do you need to pay your bills? Then budget for it and stick to it. Then, we haven't started. If we continue to pay our civil servants, I signed off on payments to staff for 200,000 naira, 300,000 naira a month. And these were technical staff. I'm not talking about drivers or cleaners. I'm talking about technical staff. And then how do I, in all honesty, expect them to deliver? And they have school fees to pay like I do. They have homes, bills to pay. So I do think at some point we have to have an honest conversation as a society. Do we want our public sector to work? And what do we need to do to enable it work? I think until we do that, we will have parastatals that shine and decline, which is what happens. We will not have any part of our public sector that will grow consistently and sustainably into the future if we don't address the fundamentals. And so far, I don't think we're ready to have that conversation.
Absolutely. So you just highlighted the fact that we can't talk about any of this in isolation. It all exists within a certain political context, a certain administrative context, and there's an expectation that we do the right thing if you're in a position of responsibility. You deliver. So let's move on.
But to do the right thing takes a lot of courage. As when I got into government, you try to do the right thing, people abuse you, you've come with your Oyibo tendency, this is Nigeria, this is how you should be doing it. You're educated about the country that you love and you want to serve. And you can't resist all the time, because if you resist all the time, you fail. So you have to adapt to some extent and resist to some extent and find your own sweet spot. But nobody, you define the risk that you're ready to take. And everyone leading an organization, the public sector in Nigeria, is taking risks every day in running that organization, because you can fail different ways. You can fail by saying, listen, I will not be flexible on anything and follow the book, talks. You will not move. Yeah. So you need a little bit of flexibility, and in that lies the banana peel for every public sector leader, especially in our beloved country.
So it's a very delicate balance, isn't it? You're really walking knife edge.
Absolutely, every single day.
Every single day. So just to further illustrate that point, I'd like us to move on into the moment when everything was tested in real time. COVID-19, a very difficult time in all of our lives. You must have been making decisions faster than the evidence was evolving, no doubt about it.
But we had to.
So here's my question. How often did you find that the right scientific decision was in conflict with political expediency?
Two things. Firstly is the understanding of science itself and how it works. Our society, science evolves because there's new knowledge being generated every day. So people have to understand that science is not constant. That when you have a new disease that we are learning new things about every day, you have to explain to people that, and which is what we try to do, that what I tell you today might be the right thing to do, might change tomorrow. And I am not flip-flopping. It is just that the science is evolving.
Absolutely.
And we are learning more. So that's very important in understanding, firstly, how science works. The second thing, and the privilege I had at the NCDC, and many people have been critical of our previous president, may so rest in peace, President Buhari for many reasons. And I'm not here to make any judgment call on that. But the one call he made that I remain eternally grateful to him is he gave us our full backing as the experts that understood the problem that we're facing. Through the leadership of Mr. Boss Mustafa, Mr. President said, listen, I will not tell you what to do. And we could see how it happened around the world. Many other presidents were on TV every morning talking about things they barely understood. But Mr. President left the expertise to us. And I'm grateful to him for doing that, because we then confronted the country with our evolving knowledge every evening, explaining to Nigerians what was going on and what we understood and what they could do and what they shouldn't. And, he did not interfere with that. And I think that gave the response in Nigeria a lot of credibility and has served us well as an example for the world.
Of course, absolutely. And that's very reassuring to hear that Mr. President, God rest his soul, backed off and he let the science take the lead, but you were still operating within a certain context. And to borrow a leaf from the title of your book, An Imperfect Storm, it was far from perfection all round, wasn't it? So I'd like to ask, even in spite of what you already described, where precisely, with benefit of hindsight, did you say that governance, not science, let Nigeria, perhaps even Africa, down the most during that pandemic?
Yeah, in terms of governance, I think one area we struggled with in Nigeria specifically was our federal structure. I just referred to them, Mr. President, but the reality is we had 36 states, right? And there were 2 states in Nigeria that basically resisted the structures of the federal government. One was Cross River, and the other was Kogi. Cross River eventually came around and followed our guidance.
Why? What was the rationale for that resistance?
It was so, the rationale was a perceived understanding of the science of what was happening better than the expertise from NCDC. But in credit to Cross River, they came around. In Kogi, the governor at the time insisted, listen, there's no COVID in Kogi. A state that had 9 states, borders recognized, they stopped us from testing. Literally, with the forces of the state, transported and evicted an NCDC team that had come into Kogi to Lokoja to support and escorted them back to Abuja and went on national TV explaining and denigrating the work we're doing. So I think one of the big governance challenges is how do we ensure that in a federal structure where there's a national crisis, and this cannot be unique to NCDC, it could be a security crisis, it could be a transport crisis, it could be anything, that we still have a mechanism to coordinate our efforts. So that's, I think, one of the big governance challenges that we faced. The other one, I think, is a much more medical example, I think, is what we got over was, the introduction of new medicines into the portfolio that we use. No matter how hard I tried to explain to Nigerians and our colleagues that there was no value in giving medicines like ivermectin or zinc or at some point chloroquine, many of our colleagues insisted that they had, it worked for them and their patients, as they say. Anecdotal evidence, yes, absolutely. And there's no mechanism to stop this. And, it continued right up to the end of the pandemic. The ivermectin became one of the largest selling medicines in Nigeria, used for a condition where it had basically no effect and probably cost harm.
Yeah.
So there are all these challenges, but, I think they're all part of a developing economy, and hopefully we find ways of addressing this into the future.
Of course. And picking up on the ivermectin example, I can't resist. To what extent do you feel that perhaps pharma, a big pharma, played a part in the entire global understanding of how to respond to this?
It's hard to say, what role they played and what role a population like ours that is sometimes fairly vulnerable. And the fact that there were big proponents of this from countries that we looked up to and they had access to media and all of this that were pushing these myths. But so it comes back to the point I made at the beginning. How do you understand science? How do I understand that paracetamol works to reduce fevers and headaches? It's not just by thinking it does. There is a process to define what works, and it's important for us to understand that, especially as professionals,
Of course.
and be in a position to advise our patients.
Of course. So Chikwe, you wrote at some stage, precisely in August 2024, it was published, book called An Imperfect Storm. And here I am, leafing through the pages here. A very well written book, which you co-authored with your lovely wife, Viviane Ihekweazu. I read this really as a very deeply personal account, not just of your leadership, but of leadership, and I dare say institutions under pressure. To what extent did you feel that you needed to write this book at that point?
Yeah, thanks, Stokes. I think the first answer to your question is most of the credit actually goes to Vivian. Vivian is, like you said, my dear wife. She runs a health advocacy communications firm called Nigeria Health Watch. But, it was really from the stories I told her every evening. I would get back from work, sometimes 11, 12, sometimes later. And every evening she would wait up for me in the sitting room. The first obvious question was, how was your day? And, I would tell her story after story, and, her jaw would drop and then drop even further at the stories I was sharing about the work we were doing. And she kept notes. And those notes form the foundation of the book, An Imperfect Storm. So thanks a lot to her that we have a book today. But the other thing is, having gone through this pandemic, I felt a sense of responsibility to write about a country that worked when the country needed it to work. And unfortunately, we don't have too many examples. But having had a front seat through that period, seen a small team that most Nigerians had never heard about, stand up, respond, do their best, lead through adversity, support our leadership, support the people, gain the trust and confidence of Nigerians. I felt this was a part of our history that I had a responsibility to write. So if today you are appointed into leading a public sector parastatal or whatever leadership position in public sector, you can pick up this book, or anyone actually worried about our country, you can pick up this book and be inspired that this wasn't a story of Nigeria being saved by any group of people externally. This is a book about Nigerians that stood up during a difficult period and did not let the country down. And it was a story too important not to tell.
Yes. And of course, for me, a real life account, almost a coming of age story, really, about growing up institutionally through that period for you and for the nation. I'm not going to read directly from it. I'm going to read a paraphrase in advance that I've scripted. For me, one of the most powerful themes that emerged quietly across the pages of this book, like COVID-19 really did not create Nigeria's weaknesses. It revealed them. And in doing so, revealed the few institutions that you've already mentioned that have been quietly built to withstand pressure. I'd like to go back and take another bite, the cherry there, and try and understand how you as an individual were feeling as you went through that period of what I would call institutionalization under constraint?
So this period, the period prior to the beginning of the pandemic, right? I knew I couldn't be an aloof leader with a grand vision that wasn't ready to get his hands dirty. So what we did was to push every aspect of our institution to believe in itself, to look for ways to improve, to thrive for improvement. I was lucky, like I said earlier, we're young parastatals, so I had an opportunity to recruit early and really pulled in lots of young people, 2, 3, 4 years out of uni to come in with that energy. And they did, we built an IT infrastructure, we built systems, but most importantly was they knew I wouldn't drop the ball. I was the first person in the office, the last person to leave every single day, every single day. Weekends, if my team was working in the lab on weekends, I would go to the lab. I would sit down with them. My wife would cook packs of food. We would take them. I was vested in the institution and its future and its progress and its people. Magic happens. Colleagues who had never published a paper ever in their lives, they didn't know what publishing meant for successful careers. And, it's just an example. We worked with them. We put their work onto manuscripts. These manuscripts started getting accepted. You saw your name as a first author on the paper in the Lancet. And, people start contacting you. This article you wrote on Lassa fever, and published, so they started getting excited about the opportunities for them.
Correct.
There were training opportunities. Colleagues, institutions from the West would say, okay, I've heard about the work you're doing. We want to offer you. There was a specific colleague. He went to do a bioengineering training in Japan, right? So they would offer us one position. I said, no, guys, please, we're a big country. Can you give me 3? So, these young people who had never had an international passport.
Off they went.
And came back transformed because they experienced what I know I experienced growing, that there are possibilities. And so, when you're on a transformation journey, the beginning is hard because you have to convince people on the possibilities, Stokes. But once they start experiencing this and start sharing the stories with their peers, and suddenly they're pushing themselves. It's not me pushing them anymore, But I think that beginning is very tough, and people are watching you very carefully on whether you are ready to walk the walk that you are asking them to go on. So, incredible experience. There are many, many challenges in the beginning, but happy we had the opportunity to serve when it was needed.
Absolutely, Chikwe. I'd like to move on now to talk about, of course, the global health architecture and the limits and power.
Yeah.
You now sit, of course, at the heart of the global health security architecture at the World Health Organization. Your influence and oversight is across HQ in the regions and the country offices, country levels. From that exalted vantage point, can you tell me where you feel that global health governance actually breaks down?
So, just comparing my experience in Nigeria to my experience globally with the World Health Organization today, I think the big difference is when you're working at the national level, you have the authority of a sovereign state behind you. Of course, the geographical coverage is smaller, but you have an elected government that gives you the authority to do the work, to give instructions.
As you had at the NCDC.
At the NCDC. At the World Health Organization, there's no global government. So this is a multilateral member state organization that have agreed to work together on a set of complex issues around health that requires constant consensus to move forward.
So the global mandate is a statement of intentions.
More or less, by countries that have agreed to collaborate, right? It's very powerful on its own, but it's not the same as a mandate of the state. So you have to constantly build trust, make sure you build consensus in a very difficult world, in the world we live in today. WHO was created in the post-Second World War after a very traumatic period, and the world came together. And now it's divergent in many different ways, but in that divergence is the confidence that we have to keep reassuring each of our member states that we will continue acting in the collective best interest of the world. And, and just sitting in the World Health Assembly last year and seeing the world come together to sign a new pandemic agreement, despite the challenges, was probably one of the most fulfilling moments of my life to have been part of that process.
So I asked that question to ask this, really. And I'm thinking about the specific mandate of the Berlin Hub, just to give countries better access to, you mentioned it earlier, data, tools, insights in times of crisis. So are nations, therefore, in your view, genuinely prepared to share information fast enough to prevent the next pandemic?
Yeah. So it's very difficult in the work that we do to say they are as prepared as they should be. What I can say with a lot of confidence that they are much better prepared than they have ever been. And the pandemic agreement signed in May last year basically has a commitment where countries have agreed to share information around pathogens in order, and what they get out of it is a guarantee that they will have access to a certain proportion of countermeasures such as vaccines that are produced based on where the need is the greatest. And that was the biggest failing of the pandemic response, that many countries had access to vaccines a lot earlier than others based on their ability to buy, but based on their ability to pay for them. But the fundamental requirement for this is that you're sharing the information, like you mentioned, that defines where the risk is greatest. And that's what we're working on. There are many aspects of the problem. There's a technological challenge. There's a challenge of infrastructure, there's a challenge of governance, there's a challenge of national rules. So the only way this can be achieved is when there's an agreement with all the countries in the world that we agree to share information as necessary. So, it's work in progress. It still keeps me awake at night that if there's a threat, that we do all the right things. But we're pushing on it every day, and quietly in the background, most of our work is done without fanfare. And let's hope that we, are fast enough to respond, because just the last point of this, nature is a challenge. We have to accept viruses evolve. There are many large ungoverned spaces around the world. The intersection between wildlife and humans and the environment is very fragile. And that's really where the threats emerge from. And it's both scientific, governance, technology that we hope to have all the tools we need to respond to this.
Absolutely. So Chikwe, of course, you sit in a very critical position. And precisely for that reason, I feel that I ought to perhaps ask that question again. And this time, encourage us to look at the flip side of the question I asked earlier. I not so much about genuine preparedness now, but I'd like to ask a question about genuine willingness to share. So I'll ask again. So are nations, in your view, genuinely willing this time to share information fast enough with other countries in order to prevent the next pandemic? We saw what happened last time. Africa wasn't exactly at the front end of the queue. We were quite low down the pecking order, were we not?
Yeah, Tokta, I don't want to build a picture of a romantic world. There are differences, political differences, but sometimes there are also just technical differences that we have built systems in neighboring countries that makes sharing very difficult. So we're confronting this with from many fronts. And I do think that there's an increasing understanding that in this space, building borders around your own geographical entity, whatever it is not the most effective way of protecting that entity. The most effective way is if there's a threat from somewhere else, that collectively we have the tools to stop the threat wherever it's emerging from before it gets to your boundaries. So not building a wall is not really effective if it's spreading everywhere because of the interconnectivity, because people travel, because trade happens, right? So I think the more we educate each other on the benefits of mutual support, that this is not charity, it's actually in our own enlightened selfish, that if there's an emerging disease in one corner of the world, that the world comes together and stops the threat there. It doesn't help us to allow that threat. You can think about it as a fire. It doesn't help you if you're the big block to put fire protection in only your own apartment and ignore the fire emerging somewhere else. So I think as long as we are conscious about how to mitigate these threats, the more will come together. And that's why the negotiations that happened prior to May, and now the deep negotiations happening around the pathogen access and benefit sharing system and annex to the pandemic agreement is so important. And, sitting in that room with our member states negotiating this agreement at the moment, seeing how they are confident in their perspectives, but also making progress towards consensus. It's such an eye-opening experience on how the international system works and why it's very important to sustain and maintain it.
Of course, and of course we speak with a consciousness of a political and a geopolitical context, reality here, which and that's absolutely correct. But I do need to ask. I mean, you've talked already about the negotiated mandate, albeit strong, of the WHO. But I do need to ask, specifically, given the direction in which the world is moving, we're seeing almost a renaissance of imperial power and a strengthening of borders and protectionist tendencies. To what extent are you confident that the aspirations that you have so eloquently spoken about will move unhindered across borders? To what extent do you feel that the stronger nations actually buy into this, given where we are now?
Yeah, so I can't say I'm not worried. You see what is happening around the world and how it affects, how we think of each other. And this is not just in different parts of the world, even on our continent, the notions of sovereignty are getting stronger and they are important and emotionally attractive. But there are parts of our living that we have to work together on. The fact that there are planes flying across the skies around the world means that there has been some agreement that the aviation is so important that we can't manage this by every country managing its own airspace. We have to find a way of managing the airspace so that our planes are not bumping into each other. That has to be negotiated globally. The fact that you can take your card issued in Europe to Beijing to withdraw money, to DC to withdraw money, to Johannesburg to withdraw money, means that there has been a consensus that financial services are so important for us to live in the world that we have to have a framework to work together. So that's the same way I see infectious diseases. Infectious diseases don't recognize borders. There are many circumstances that make it, a challenge that we have to work together on. And so that's my message, that, despite the challenges in the world, we from the health sector will not bring peace back to us or negotiate political differences. But we can rise above all of that and say, in this area, we have to collaborate despite our political differences or ideological differences. And that's the point really we're pushing. And in some cases, our work might actually be an opportunity for peace.
Absolutely. So if a dangerous pathogen were to emerge tomorrow, what single governance weakness would worry you the most?
The biggest worry I think I would have is access to countermeasures. Access to the vaccines, to the diagnostics, to the treatments that we require to confront the challenge. There have been a lot of progress made in the last few years, and we've tried to drive the speed and efficiency with which we can produce these countermeasures. But I don't think we're yet at the point where I am comfortable that we will be fast enough to prevent spread from a new emergent influenza virus from somewhere in the world. So we have to keep working on it, and that's something I think we can come together to continue to do.
So Chikwe, let's now talk specifically about Africa's place in this global architecture. We learned some very hard lessons from COVID, with no doubt about that. We do live in a real world that we discussed and we've accepted in this conversation already. But I'd like to ask first, and I'd like you to consider this question separately. Are we as a continent still structurally disadvantaged in terms of global health security? And of course, part B of that question is who precisely benefits from the imbalance that is created?
So, Tokes, I think this is a very important question. There is, of course, still a big imbalance and access to resources, access to skills and expertise. But a lot of this can be changed by us. This will not be solved by others.
Absolutely.
And in many other sectors that are driven by the private sector, whether it's financial services, in tech, and banking, we are leading the pack. What are the incentives that has driven our development of certain sectors that has not driven the development of science and technology in our country? And these are big societal questions that no country can develop really without doing this. What are we investing in education, in our higher institutions? Are the universities that you and I went to, are we confident to send our children to them today? If we're not, there's a problem.
There is.
So I think we are underinvesting in science. We don't take it seriously. And it's no surprise then that we are not producing the science that we need to progress. So I think it's right to advocate for equity globally, advocate for more resources globally, and complain about the imbalance globally. But I don't think we should expect the world to come down to our levels. We must rise and push ourselves up to a competitive level in science. And I think sadly in most areas of scientific expertise, explorations, the research, we are falling back.
Absolutely. So there is coherence between us in the understanding that Africa does need to lead the way in solving its own problems. Having established that as a premise, I'd like to ask you, once we've gotten our act together, what an honest conversation, what does an honest negotiation between African leaders and global institutions look like, really, particularly in areas of sovereignty, preparedness, finance?
Well, I think we'll need another session to go to all of that in detail, but I think it will happen on many levels, right? There's the governance level, there's the access to financing, access to resources. There's the opportunity to develop our own institution, our own people here. And at the moment, we spend so much time and effort debating politics in our beloved country and sometimes on the continent. And I just don't think we're focusing enough on the basics, right? Infrastructure is important. Big roads are important. But, why should we? Let me give a hypothetical example. Almost everyone with HIV as a disease today is being treated with medicines donated by another country. Almost all the vaccines that our children receive in the public sector, bare a small proportion is funded with funds that are donated by global health institutions. Why do we as a country feel it is right for us to build our own roads and airports, but we have outsourced the treatment of our children, the vaccination of our children, the treatment of our own patients to some foreign partner? What makes health exceptional that we are not willing to fund it ourselves? This is the fundamental question, because once we have skin in the game, once we're investing in the health of our own people, the conversation will be completely different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Chikwe, we've just set up the rest of the conversation very nicely. So if we tee off on that point, we're talking really about individual responsibility, the responsibility to grow our own society, to build our own institutions, to create a much better, an expectation of a better future for generations to come. So I'd like to zero in, therefore, on you as an individual who was leading and building systems and who has sat at different levels in that chain, if you like. So let's talk about you. And none of this happens without personal cost, Chikwe. That is truth. Okay. So what was the most politically risky decision you had ever had to make in public health leadership? And what precisely did that decision cost you, Chikwe?
Let me give you an honest answer, something probably I've never said in public. When the chief of staff of the Federation was diagnosed with COVID, he was one of the earliest people that turned out positive. So his testing, when he was ill, I sent a small team to his home to take a sample to do the test. It came out positive. I was too worried about it, so we repeated it. I had to give him some story to explain why we had to do the test, that the equipment was bad or something, and we just needed, but it came out positive a second time. So I had a conversation with him about the results together with my colleague, Dr. Sani Aliyu. And we were debating, this is the chief of staff of the president. It better be sure. He wanted to tell the country himself and make the announcement himself. So we had two things to do. Firstly, before he went public, we had to make sure the president himself and his family were free of the disease, given the proximity of the chief of staff to Mr. President. So I sent my best team to the villa. Quietly, they tested the president and his family and made sure none of them was infected at the time. So we were confident they were in a good place. The next dilemma was the chief of staff had insisted on sharing this news with the country. I hadn't told my boss, the Minister of Health. So I was in a very delicate situation between the chief of staff and what I knew was my responsibility to tell the Minister of Health. Ultimately, and of course, we also have the privilege of patient confidentiality with the chief of staff and his, irrespective of his role in the country. But I ultimately decided to, obey the chief of staff and let him announce his illness to the country, which he ultimately did. Because he did have less, yeah. And it was a very difficult conversation with my minister afterwards, which I'm not sure I ever recovered from. But, those are one of the challenges of service. You always have to make these decisions.
And the expectation of the minister was?
Well, I think he had a legitimate expectation that if there was a circumstance like this, he would be the first person I would confide in. Yeah. And it is a legitimate expectation. It was a tough decision, but, like in many hard decisions in governance, sometimes you have to swing one way or the other.
So it was really a question of the chain of command and how you pass information.
Yes, absolutely. And, sometimes you stick with your conscience and you do what you think you can live with afterwards.
Absolutely. Of course, it's an unassailable principle in medicine. Patients have a right to their own information and to administer it as they choose.
Absolutely. And I wasn't in a position to share that if he didn't want me to share it, even if he was chief of staff.
Absolutely. So let's go on and delve a bit deeper into this in that case. And I'd like to use institutional independence as an instrument for this, if you like. The independence of institutions, WHO, NCDC, often discussed but rarely understood. We've talked about the level of responsibility and power, if you like, that exists at the different levels. In many respects, it's actually a more reassuring for an individual in your position than a country position, because there's a nation, a country mandate, isn't there? But I'd like to ask, what does independence actually mean when a crisis becomes politically charged? In other words, does authority actually sit with you during the crisis, or with the science, or with the politics?
It's always a balance. The independence is necessary, but is also often almost end through trust, right? Your independence and the authority you derive from the statutes of your organization in a specific purpose is only validated if the people that you're leading or you're advising trust not only yourself, the institution, and very often the context. So every time I speak today on behalf of WHO, I need to be sure that the science is clear on the positions I'm taking. The ethics are clear as best as I can judge them. And, it's never easy to do so, but it's the only way, because, if you start swinging right or left or wherever the wind blows, then you're always vulnerable. And, I'm really privileged to work with a leader like Dr. Tedros leading WHO at the moment, that he's very clear on his principled stand on many of the important issues in the world. And our responsibility is to really take on follow his leadership, which is always clear. And having both scientific clarity and moral clarity are very important principles from which you then derive the authority of the independence that you then advocate for.
Absolutely. Scientific and moral ethical clarity, of course, builds trust.
Absolutely.
And you derive your authority through that. So all of these things are really important. Let me press and ask you again, what do you think, in your experience, that independence is most often lost? Is it in the decision-making itself, in the communication, perhaps, or somewhere else?
Yeah, no, I think the independence, we all have to understand that the independence in of itself doesn't have much value. It really, what the independence, both where you get it from, is the authority that you derive from it in order to make decisions, and how those decisions have an impact on people that you lead. And that's very important, because people have to trust that the value of the independence is the trust that is gained out of it. And so I think that it's very important that we do have this independent thought leadership in organizations, because institutions like NCDC, like WHO, need to be in a position to look a political leader in the eye and tell him this course of action that you're proposing might be wrong, right? And if he doesn't have the scientific independence and authority and ethical clarity to do that, and then you may just tend to tell the leader what you think the leader wants to hear from you. And I'll give you a very good example. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were cases around the world evolving, especially in Europe, and we had a conversation at the very highest level. And I was in the middle of the room. Is your advice, Mr. DG NCDC, as I was called, to shut down airports? This is nothing to do. Of course, it had consequences on the spread of a pandemic. But you can imagine being asked for your advice on whether Nigeria should close down its airspace and close all its international airports. And your response? I looked at the circumstances at the time and advised in the affirmative. And in 2 days, our airspace was closed. So these are to derive the authority to advise the president of a country. You have to have both the scientific rigor and ethical clarity that you are not protecting anyone's interests. You're not working for any other interest other than to protect the country from the threat that you are supporting the country to protect itself from. So these are hugely consequential decisions where if you had a leader of a parastatal like NCDC where there wasn't trust, you're worried about his political affiliation or his whatever other affiliation, the president will not have the trust in you to trust the independence of your advice. So that's the point I'm trying to make, that it's not necessarily the independence itself, but what authority does it give you or what confidence does it give you to give the most consequential advice in certain circumstances?
Absolutely. So the independence of the science, if you like, is really protected by the authority derived through trust. And that's the only way really you can speak honestly about things in real time. You can always deploy resources quickly in a crisis when you need it. But I'd like to press in on the other side of that question. Where does that independence of science derived through trust, as you said, of course it's important, but what does it demand that you protect at times of crisis?
It's very important that both you're seen, that you consult widely yourself as a leader. Nobody expects, and you shouldn't expect it of yourself, to have all the knowledge that is necessary. It's always important to say, and even in our work in WHO, it's always clear, we invite all the experts in the world around specific topics to provide advice to the leadership on issues. So firstly, there has to be broad consultation with other experts in that field so that you derive the consensus position through scientific knowledge, acquisition, collation, but also consensus. And when you provide that, to make sure that you're providing it and stating clearly, this is the best information we have at the moment, that our understanding might change as science evolves. So it also requires a population and a group to be fairly understanding of how science works. And together, both from how it comes together and how you deliver it, and critically, how you communicate it. And one of the biggest challenges and opportunities that I had during this pandemic was the opportunity of speaking to 200 million Nigerians every single evening for a while, and that gave them, I hope, the confidence to understand that we've got your back on this, and hopefully led us to emerging from it not in a bad place.
Absolutely. So when the science becomes inconvenient, therefore, if you like, and the politics becomes by lab, to what extent do you expect yourself, your staff, your leaders to be protected, shielded, insulated by the politics itself?
That's absolutely necessary, because there's a time your political leadership needs to come in and say, almost transfer their authority to you or protect you with their authority. And, I think, like I said earlier, that's what happened very well at the national level. and what sometimes did not happen sufficiently in the state level in a few states. But it's very important that that comes in and protects you and supports the work you're doing. If not, you're left alone, and that's not where anyone wants to be.
Yeah. So Chikwe, I remember reading an article you wrote you published in Nigeria Health Watch, I think it was 2014, 2015. And I think it said Nigeria needs its own Center for Disease Control. And hey presto, a few years later, you were doing the load-bearing work of leading the NCDC as its first Director General. So, but then before 2016, we were responding to epidemics, were we not? But no institution really owned that responsibility. I think it's fair to say. So looking back now, I'd like your opinion on this. What was the real cost of that institutional absence? Not just in terms of outcomes, but in terms of coherence, authority, and speed.
Yeah, it's, Tokes, when I was just appointed, I was appointed in the summer of 2016. Later that year, and early 2017, many people would have forgotten this. There was a big meningitis outbreak in northwestern Nigeria, covering Sokoto, Kebbi, and Zamfara states. The institution barely wasn't existing, but we put some things together. I drove with the team up to Sokoto. We drove around Kebbi, Zamfara. If you've seen a case of meningitis, you will never forget. It's a terrible disease, right? But I saw patients being managed with infusions hanging on trees outside the premises of hospitals and clinics because the wards were full. At the time, there was no national reference lab. There wasn't any lab to actually test and confirm, and to get a sample from a case of meningitis is a pretty tricky thing. You have to take that's a final fluid. Mm-hmm. So very difficult disease to treat, to manage, to diagnose. We then did an analysis of that particular situation and analyzed the number of deaths that we could have prevented if we had the capacity to act a little bit earlier than we did. We were very open with this. And I say to the team, we are responsible for these number of deaths. We may not be able to prevent every outbreak because you have to find them. But once you know that there's an outbreak, you must be able to prevent its spread and reduce the number of cases. So how does this link back to your question? I think in our country, we had normalized the fact that people die from meningitis, that people die from measles, that people die from cholera. I mean, these are diseases no one else is dying from. Why should Nigerians be dying from cholera? That can be absolutely prevented. You cannot get cholera if you drink clean water. Yeah, it's impossible. So there are diseases that no one else around the world is dying from. That have basically, if you work in the UK, you would never see a case of cholera throughout your career. So the lack of an institution with the knowledge, the expertise to drive this expertise, to drive the country forward in this area has cost us millions of lives. And that's why now we have one. I hope it continues to grow. I hope it continues to find its mandate, find its space, and grow its service to our country. The work we started in 2016 cannot stop. We have to keep growing this institution. The US CDC has over 50,000 people working for it. Nigeria CDC has less than 500 today. So if we want an institution to fulfill its mandate for the Nigerian people, we have to invest in this space and keep investing. If not, we'll keep losing our best. And that's not how any country grows.
Absolutely. And prior to that time, prior to 2016, of course, surveillance existed, professionals existed, even some level of coordination after a fashion. Yet, of course, it was clear that something fundamental was missing. We've defined and described that something fundamental that was missing. So, but my question is, how do you, as a systems leader and builder, recognize that moment where activity is present, but of course, that institutional ownership is missing?
So, Tokes, when I got to NCDC, yeah, you're right, surveillance did happen. So every local government would collect data on infectious diseases, store them on an Excel sheet, send that Excel sheet to the state level. Someone at the state level will collate 20 Excel sheets, for example, from 20 local governments, try and put it together into one. And then the states will try and collate that, so it was a completely dysfunctional system, right? We started the digital surveillance system with a very simple platform called SORMAS, introduced this sequentially into all the states, all the local governments. So once you enter that data at the LGA, we can see it immediately on dashboards that we put up as a national. This is not cutting edge science. These are basics, right? So by transforming a system and making it easier for everyone to do the work they were doing, and then for people to see the results of the reason we could tell Nigerians at the pandemic every day, if you remember, every evening at 9 p.m., we would announce the number of new cases, the number of deaths. The reason we could do that was a system we had put in place 2 years prior the beginning of the pandemic. So this is how we can grow as a country. This is just one example, to put in the systems, to build those systems, to trust them, to enable their growth. And then slowly, we save ourselves from tragedies that can happen. So I think it's very important that we keep pushing on these small opportunities to develop the work that we do. But, there are no short-term solutions. You have to think long-term, solve one problem, and that problem takes you way into the future.
So if we apply that lens more broadly to the broad cameras of Nigeria's healthcare system, we've talked about the fact that, of course, activity can exist in the absence of, structured of progress and structured institutionalized progress, and for that matter. Do you see other parts of the healthcare system across this country in which, of course, activity exists, but there isn't that institutional ownership, that harmony? Do you see it elsewhere outside of public?
Let me flip your question slightly and actually demonstrate one area where I see a lot of progress. For years, our health financing has been in a mess. We've never been sure, are we running a tax-funded system, an insurance-funded system, a fee-for-service funded system? Because we're doing all of them in various ways, shapes, and form. For many years, you ask people, how many insured Nigerians do we have? No one can give you an answer. But now I see for the first time some serious thinking happening in National Health Insurance Agency in this country. I can see progress happening, digitalization, HMOs being pushed further than ever before. And I'm confident that if the institution is allowed to grow and continue, that we can have a similar transformation in the health insurance and health financing landscape. But none of this can be done overnight. So each of these transformations of specific areas require time, energy, and consistency. And I worry sometimes that our 4-year political cycles is really an impediment for progress in the health sector, because the health sector is not, progress is never rapid. You need time. No matter how good the idea is and the transformation is, you need time. You need policy consistency, leadership consistency. And if there's a change in the political landscape after 4 years, and a whole new set of leaders come in, the risk is that no matter how good ideas are, they never just have the time to go.
But Chikwe, is the 4-year political cycle the problem, or the lack of a coordinated handover and buy-in from one administration to the
Yeah, I
next?
mean, they're all linked. I don't have any magic insights into what the problems are, but they're all components of this. And very, very often, you see great initiatives that die not because they're not perceived to be valuable, but because, the next leader doesn't want to be associated with something that the previous leader started, unfortunately. So,
And I think, of course, we agree that that ought not to be the case.
absolutely.
And should it? So many countries, Nigeria included, use the terms primary care and primary healthcare interchangeably. From a systems point of view, could you tell me what you think is lost when a clinical care system like primary care is more or less subsumed within a public health program? You know what I'm leading up to.
Yeah, I think, it's a complex question and with complex set of circumstances, but
To make it clear, yes.
yeah, well, I do. So let me give a simple example, going back to our health financing anecdote, so we can continue from that example, right? When you start a health insurance model, but you continue funding your public health care delivery through taxation or through money, then there's no incentive for people to move from one to the other. So for health insurance really to work, money has to follow the patient, right? And so you take money out of tax funded systems into insurance funded models, and that way there's an incentive for people to pay and to derive benefit. And then the system grows. You have to see this as a system that is interconnected at all the levels. So I do think, the radical reform that have happened in other sectors, I go back to what I said in the beginning. We are, the Ministry of Health, if you go to the ministry today, it still has the same departments that it had 40 years ago, right? So we are not courageous. There are many impediments to actually transforming the sector. So the question you're asking, I don't think, why I've gone off a little bit on a tangent is, I don't think the problem is that we don't understand what needs to be done. I just don't think that the political imperatives have allowed us to do what we need to do. And whether it comes to paying doctor salaries and strikes and infrastructure or hospitals, there are really fundamental questions. I hope we can get to a space where we can answer them.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to name it because you're eminently qualified to do so, Chikwe. So in your experience, what usually needs to happen, therefore, politically, intellectually, institutionally, before a country is ready to move from funding activity to building that missing institutional spine? That's what we're talking about, after all.
Yeah, I think right now we have probably the most aspirational Minister of Health that we've had for a long time. And I've seen real fundamental changes happening in the sector at the policy level, addressing very important areas around the value chain, for instance, in health products, manufacturing, distribution, access. But there's a bigger issue in terms of, what is the consensus on what a state government should be doing, what the federal government should be doing in terms of healthcare. I was surprised when I came back to Nigeria and I asked a colleague, my peer, who was a consultant in a teaching hospital at the time, I don't know if it's changed, as a consultant, what is your commitment to the care you're providing? Do you have a consultant's contract that articulates, as a consultant, these are the number of rounds, the number of clinics that I was? No, I don't know if it's changed. So if you don't know, if what you're expected to do is not articulated in any position, how can you be held accountable for what you're doing.
Right.
You know, I went back to the teaching hospital where I trained in Enugu at the time, maybe a few years ago, so the numbers might be different. There were 23 consultants in obstetrics and gynecology in a single teaching hospital. I asked them, how many deliveries happen? How many patients do you see? You know, there's a big disconnect between. So it's very easy to say doctors are on strike, doctors are not paid well, but we have to really look at the fundamentals. And so why I'm avoiding answering your question, I think that too many of us that jump to the answers without going to say, listen, a teaching hospital serves this purpose. These are the human resources it needs. These are the other resources it needs. This is how we'll measure it. And based on this, we will fund you with X. And until we do that, you know, how many primary health centers are there in Nigeria? Who is receiving what resources? What patients are there? You know, if we don't know this, we cannot manage. So we cannot manage stuff that we cannot measure. And so I'd rather avoid answering the questions of how we can fix, to start with the question of how we can understand. And once we can understand, we can start a process of fixing. But that's, I think, the starting point of where we need to land in our sector.
Absolutely. And in many ways, you've answered the question, because we're talking about building like missing institutional spine. The first thing is we have to be comfortable, I suppose, operating in a certain vagueness, not preempting the answers to questions, but as you said, aligning what the purpose should be with the necessary steps that need to follow. So I'd like, we've talked a lot already about COVID and pandemic preparedness and epidemics, but we've also talked very briefly earlier, and you've dipped into this from time to time. Some of the other examples and experiences you've had. So talk to me about meningitis, Ebola, monkeypox.
So let me actually start with Lassa fever, because Lassa fever is a disease that is unique to West Africa. The ecology of West Africa enables its transmission. We had and have a big challenge in Nigeria. So when I came in, there was some expertise, especially in the Irua in Edo State, Irua Specialist Teaching Hospital, but we were not investing anything in the science, in understanding the disease, in the diagnostics. So I saw this as a challenge, but also as an opportunity for us to lead. So the initial thought process was to expand the expertise from Irua. First, we started to 2 other centers that had a significant amount of cases in Owo in Ondo State and Abakaliki in Ebonyi State. And we supported from NCDC colleagues from these 2 other centers to go to Irua to spend a month to learn, to develop expertise, and come back and develop their centers. It was these 3 centers that ultimately were the foundation of everything we did in COVID, because that was where the infectious disease expertise was built around Lassa. So the work we do is at the intersection between science, public health, and the third area, I call it solving Nigeria's day-to-day challenges. You know, because if you pick a scientist from one place to somewhere else, and you teach him about managing cases with Lassa, and there's no running water in his ward, the basics are not there. So very often, you know, NCDC was actually providing centers, building treatment centers for teaching hospitals. No teaching hospital in Abuja, the first infectious disease teaching hospital in the federal teaching hospital in Gwagwalada, was built by NCDC and located in the hospital. So we found that our responsibilities were not just around supporting disease-specific expertise, but was in building the infrastructure around it. But the broader point is, once you start building, people start developing knowledge. our confidence grows, our expertise grows, both scientifically and clinically, and that then saves lives and also builds our own scientific competence. So the disease might be slightly different, but the thinking process on how to prevent, how to manage, how to treat, infection prevention and control, are very often similar between them. So what you learn from one, you take to another, and collectively as a country, we grow our expertise.
Absolutely. So Chikwe, you obviously have spent a significant part of your career focused on the public sector and public health. You sit now in a very strategic vantage position at the World Health Organization. But of course, we are sitting in a country which is perhaps, reflective of what is happening across much of sub-Saharan Africa as well, in which we are largely dependent on progress being reverse engineered from the private sector into the public sector. But there has to be an optimum balance. What is your vision for how the public sector and the private sector ought to work together?
So I firstly, to think that we are an incredibly blessed country, and blessed in many different ways, right? Firstly, is a little bit of just coincidence that, everyone in my generation, our generation, that was kind of fairly competent in the sciences to a certain level was pushed into medicine.
Yes.
Right? Whether we liked it or not. So we already have a selection of very good people, even if I say that, academically gifted individuals in this field, right? And secondly, a few of us have had opportunities to train, to become specialists, and we also grew up in an incredibly hopeful time in Nigeria, in the 70s and 80s, early 90s, where many of us, were formative years. We're really hopeful. And that had a lasting imprint in many of us, myself as well. So what we haven't done sufficiently is translate this emotional desire and competence to do better for our country into reality, because the systems constrain us. So I think as we begin to unravel and open up these opportunities, there are many. We have many of our colleagues, our peers. Yes, I'm in public health, but we're all part of wider medical communities. I've seen many colleagues come in, set up practices, figure out how to swim in this very difficult area, right? And do incredibly inspiring work, set up hospitals, services, not just in Lagos, but across the country. Despite the challenges, we have to remove the despite and actually see this as an opportunity and not a constraint or a competition for the public sector, and see how can the public sector use the private sector or benefit from the private sector and vice versa. And I think that's where magic might happen if we get it right, because, we have probably the biggest pool of skilled health sector professionals, not just doctors, around the world. And we have to be intentional on how to bridge that gap. Again, I don't want to provide all the solutions, but I think that there's an untapped opportunity in that space.
Of course. And of course, one of the essential roles that must be warehoused in the public sector is that it sits as a body, if you like, to commission and to regulate.
Absolutely.
Standards and to commission services.
Absolutely.
Can I tempt you to comment on that and perhaps append to that anything else you feel should be happening in the public sector and that it's intersection with the private sector?
Yeah, you see, I think that for us in this space, there's actually nothing new to be done, because a lot of these things have been solved in many other contexts. We just need to understand, how do we adapt, not bring everything, no copy and paste solution, but adapt them to our context, And when I did a small project in one of the states in southeastern Nigeria, and I went to the State Ministry of Health at the time, and I asked them for a registry of the hospitals in that state. I was given a notebook, handwritten notebook with names and vague addresses. How do we manage started sector in state X if we don't even know who is practicing here, what's your bed capacity, what services you provide? So either the public sector has to have the competence, expertise to be able to manage the sectors. Managing it means first understanding what you have, where the gaps are, what and all of that. So, yeah, I don't want to sound too negative. What I say is in that gap are the opportunities, incredible opportunities to open up and to serve our country, and not to compete across sectors, but really to benefit from the resources that we all bring.
Certainly. So, Chikwe, with everything that you have seen, both institutionally as well as personally, what kind of leadership do you feel that the world, that Africa, that Nigeria needs in advance of the next global crisis?
Wow. The leadership is such a broad term, but in certain areas, I don't think we can get away from finding the expertise that we need to run whatever we want to run. If we don't think that a teacher can fly an airplane, if we don't think that a doctor can run a telecoms organization, why do we think that we have to consider all sorts of factors in looking for who will run our big teaching hospitals, who maybe have never had any managerial experience? Where will they get it from when they're given an institution like that to run? So I do think we have to be intentional. I know that in our country we have to solve for geographical diversity, we have to solve for religious diversity, we have to solve for all sorts of issues. Granted, within our 200 million people, we should be able to do that. But to get our country to work in specific cases, we need the expertise, the people that understand what they're asked to do, have proven that expertise, and are committed to working and delivering on that issue.
So what next for Chikwe Ihekweazu like this?
Well, Stokes, I'm really in a privileged position at the moment. I'm very lucky to work with a team at the World Health Organization where every day, leading the Emergencies Programme, I'm constantly at the alert in terms of where the next challenge is coming from. On the infectious disease front, I'm fairly confident that we have progressed a lot. What really hurts me at the moment in terms of our work is the countries where there's a big public health crisis, consequence of a political crisis. So countries that are unstable for whatever reason, where the big health consequences that we have to deal with, because a little bit we're at the bottom of the pyramid and we can't really influence the politics. So I'm lucky to be there. I'm lucky and happy and proud to be working with a leader that I trust and I'm committed to. And we'll see what the future holds.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I won't press you any further.
Thank you.
But I will speak of the future. So finally, Chikwe, after everything you've experienced, the crises, the politics, the pressure, what precisely gives you hope about the world we live in today?
Yeah, Tokes, what gives me hope? Literally, two things. First, my experience at NCDC is we are a gifted country. If I had taken on face value what I had seen in the first month of my time at NCDC, I would have run away. But we are a resilient people. It is the same people that grew, that developed themselves, that developed the expertise, that went way over the call of duty. The first 3 months of the pandemic, nobody was working in Nigeria. Everybody was home. We had 20 teams from NCDC in 20 states in Nigeria supporting them. There was no foreign support. There are no partners. This was the core team. So I have seen our country work. It's an incredible experience seeing it work. So that leaves me with a lot of hope about the future. I think being at the World Health Organization at the moment is also quite an eye-opening experience because of the multilateral nature of the work that we do. And the fact that doing the World Health Assembly, where every country is on the table, and whether you're Seychelles with 200,000 people, or whether you're China with 1.4 billion people, you sit around the same table, you have conversations, you have 2 minutes each to speak, and you have to reach consensus. And I have witnessed the power of that process and why it is so important that as long as we have nation states in the world, we have to go through that consensus building process in a space like public health. So my life is already a blessing, and to have played a small role in these processes, I think I can go to bed and sleep well at night. But my job is not done.
Dr. Chikwe Ihekweazu, thank you for your service. Thank you for joining us on One-to-One.
Thank you very much, Dukes.
Thank you, Chikwe.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.